Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. One of the most underrated storylines for this Nebraska program heading into spring practice in the 2024 season was bringing in Glenn Thomas as your co-offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach, a guy that has had a ton of success working with Matt Rhule at both Temple and Baylor. And we got to hear him for the first time in the Nebraska colors at the press conference earlier today. Want to do two things. One, talk about Glenn Thomas, talk about what he's done as a coach during his coaching career, and more importantly, talk about what it's going to look like with this quarterback battle that we're going to see in spring practice. Really excited to get into this one. Glenn Thomas was a hire that, the Nebraska fans that have been rocking with the boys for a while remember me hopping on when Glenn Thomas took this job, and I was fired up for this one. I think Glenn Thomas is a very well-respected quarterbacks coach, both at the NFL and the college football level, and has had a ton of success working with both Coach Satterfield and Matt Rhule at a stops at Temple and Baylor. Before we get into it, just want to say thank you to you guys and a massive shout out, as always, to the Nebraska fans. This is a program the boys love talking about, whether it's on the high school trail, the transfer portal, doing these deep dives into the program. It's been a blast. Cannot thank you guys enough for all the support, all the Go Big Reds in the comments section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And this quarterback battle, this Nebraska offense is going to be a talking point for the boys for the duration of spring practice in this spring calendar. Dill, I'm going to give you the T-box here. Glenn Thomas, I know you've done a little background on Glenn Thomas. Let's start with just what he's bringing to this Nebraska offense heading into spring practice in that 2024 season.
I think what kind of stands out to me, frankly, is maybe the need for a quarterback-focused guy in this offense to maybe take a little bit of the load off of Scott Satterfield, or Marcus Satterfield, I should say, because you kind of look, that was a hard unit to coach. There were a lot of guys who needed a lot of development, and you kind of look in this year, you at least have some real talent this year coming in, but again, coming in with a couple of true freshmen, looking like the guys who are going to be relied upon a fair amount. Those guys are going to need a lot of attention, individualized work. So I think spreading this workload a little bit across and giving Marcus Satterfield the opportunity to focus more on the offensive scheme and how he's going to play call and scripting it up, and then allowing Glenn Thomas to really just dive into these quarterbacks, I think it's going to be huge because, again, I do think these quarterbacks are going to need a lot of attention by these coaches. It's not like they're coming in as like transfer guys who are fourth-year players who played a ton of college
ball. I think you hit the nail right on the head. Like, that was probably one of the bigger concerns you had with this Nebraska offense is Coach Satterfield was juggling so many different things, right? You look at that Nebraska offense and what happened. You had multiple injuries at the running back spot. You had a quarterback, like the inconsistency at quarterback play just throughout the board. And then you look at the wide receiver position kind of being forced to start multiple true freshmen during the duration of the season. Coach Satterfield had a lot of balls to keep in the air juggling. And now you bring in a guy like Glenn Thomas where, all right, Coach Satterfield, now you can focus on, you're going to move to the tight end position, work with those guys, and really focus on what this offense is going to look like from a schematic standpoint and allow Glenn Thomas to really be hands-on with these quarterbacks during spring camp and going into that 2024 year. And I think something that's massive for Glenn Thomas is, one, he's on the same page with Coach Rhule and Coach Satterfield. They've worked together. They have the same kind of view on what this offense wants to look like. But more importantly, you look at Glenn Thomas and his experience, both at the NFL and college level, with a vast variety of different quarterbacks, right? You go back to his time at Baylor with Charlie Brewer, back-to-back 3,000-yard seasons, more of a pocket passer, a guy that wants to deliver balls on time accurately from the pocket. Then you look at your time at Temple with P.J. Walker, more of a dual-threat guy that you want to get out of the pocket, let him use his mobility and his athleticism. And then you look at this Nebraska quarterback room, and that's kind of what you have. You have a guy in Dylan Raiola who might have the most talented arm of any quarterback coming from that high school class in 2024. You have a guy like Danny Kaelin, who I think is extremely talented too. And then you have a guy like Harburg, who is much more of an athletic quarterback that you want to let him use his legs. Glenn Thomas having the experience with so many different quarterbacks, including a guy like Matt Ryan at the Atlanta Falcons, I think is really going to help him kind of grab the best out of all three of those quarterbacks during his time at in spring practice and then heading into that 2024 year.
And I think the alignment's huge. Like you kind of mentioned it earlier, but like, again, when you're going to have two guys who I don't want to say this offense needs a lot of work, but I think everyone who watched last year knows the schematics have to be a little bit better. It did feel like it got a little bland, especially in the passing attack. They just didn't really open up that much. It felt like it really wasn't super creative. So, again, at the end of the day, this offense, quarterbacks need to develop at a really high level. Tight ends and wide receivers need to develop at a really high level as well. And they also need to have a scheme that kind of fits the players in his alignment. And that's where I think the alignment you talk about, bringing a guy in who's very familiar with both Coach Rule and Coach Satterfield, I think gives you a better chance to kind of make this kind of run smoothly at the end of the day, where you're not just bringing in three different parts, that is head coach, co-OC, and OC, who all kind of have a different vision. And it's hard to like implement that and get that into your quarterbacks' heads and make them see it.
And you noted something that I think was my probably biggest takeaway from Glenn Thomas at the press conference earlier today. And that was the concept of illusion of complexity. Excuse me, that word gave me some problems. The illusion of complexity is something that he talked about in the sense that you're trying to give the illusion to defenses that you're running a lot of different concepts and a lot of different schemes, a lot of different formations, and a lot of different motions. But for the quarterbacks, it's a relatively simple offense. And you look at this quarterback room heading into 2024, you want it to be simple, right? You have two true freshman quarterbacks and a guy like Henrik Harburg, who, although going into his fourth year, has not played a ton of football. And so you're keeping it simple for your quarterbacks, but you're showing the defense a lot of different looks and a lot of different motions. That's something you didn't really see. You noted it. The concepts and the schematics of that offense were really watered down for Nebraska in 2023. And I don't think that's as much of an indictment on Coach Rule and Coach Satterfield as much as they were kind of forced into doing that, right?
And you saw Coach Satterfield at South Carolina the year before really do it, I think, a good job with using motion and being creative. And again, covering up for a weak offensive line in those Gamecock schemes, in doing a lot of things to, I think, really help Rattler. But I think what he had with Rattler was a guy who was ultra experienced. So maybe he didn't need to spend as much time with the minutia of like mechanics in simple reads and all that. And again, not to say that they can't, like, you can't take a guy who needs that type of coaching, but I think you need more firepower on the offensive staff. And you even look not only Glenn Thomas, but bringing a guy like Dana Holgorsen. I just think this offensive staff should be more prepared in the aggregate. Because again, Satterfield's a good coach. I don't think that was his best year, but given all what was happening around him and how much inexperience there was, I think that was a hard place to put him in. But with this type of coaching staff now, along with far more talent in that quarterback room, I think you put yourself in a much better position to play really good offense.
You can tell Nebraska had to look at that, right? They wanted to go out and get a guy like Dana Holgorsen. I think Glenn Thomas is a phenomenal fit, though. And one other thing that I think he talked about that I was really excited about was talking about reps for quarterbacks in spring practice. You look at the landscape of the Power 5 conferences, name me another true freshman quarterback that is going to get more opportunity in reps during spring practice than Dylan Raiola and Danny Kaelin. Like, there's kind of, it's a double-edged sword, right? Nebraska's only going into the spring practice session with 3 scholarship quarterbacks. That's kind of alarming just saying it. But then you look at the benefits of it. I mean, those 3 quarterbacks are going to get a ton of reps. And I think one of the down parts of what happened with Nebraska last year in the offseason, Jeff Sims, named quarterback 1, team captain. He was the guy in this offense very early on in the process. Jeff Sims was getting a lot of those reps. And so when Jeff Sims wasn't able to play, you could tell Chubba Purdy, Henrik Harburg were not very familiar or comfortable operating this offense. You look at how this quarterback room is scheduled. I mean, for development of young quarterbacks, they're getting a ton of opportunity. You look at all the other top high school recruits that are early enrolled in that 2024 class. They're probably QB5 or QB6 in the pecking order. They're not getting a lot of work during spring practice and in fall camp. But you look at a guy like Dylan Raiola and Danny Kaelin, and Glenn Thomas said in the press conference, the way you get better at football is playing football. They're going to be playing a lot of football in spring practice. I think that was probably one of the things that excites you most about what the development is going to look like for guys like Danny Kaelin and Dylan Raiola heading into spring practice in that 2024 year, but also the next couple of years.
Yeah, and that's going to be the important part, obviously, is you just want to see Dylan Raiola and Danny Kaelin, one of them shake out to be one of those guys to lead this Nebraska team into the next era. I mean, that's what you're doing it for. When you get a guy like Dylan Raiola, it exhilarates the fan base, it exhilarates the recruiting, everything pumps up, but you also need him to come through. And again, you're starting to see, I think, Nebraska put a staff in place at the offensive side of the ball to make that as likely as possible rather than like.
And what I'd say is that was their offseason goal. I think Matt Rule, when Dylan Raiola committed to Nebraska, when we saw that pop up on our phones, what did the next couple of weeks ensue? They go in and bring Glenn Thomas. They go in and bring a guy like Jamal Banks. They go bring a guy like Isaiah Nair, Micah Mazuka, Dante Dowdle, to really just give the young quarterbacks all the talent and all the tools in place for them to be successful in the development over not only the next couple of months, but the next couple of years in this Nebraska program. Dill, Glenn Thomas, again, a hire that I think flies under the radar because you're bringing in a 5-star quarterback in Dylan Raiola, but I think could mean massive things in terms of a coach that is just dedicated to developing your young quarterbacks heading into that 2024 year. I think it's a massive storyline. Was really intrigued and kind of excited about Glenn Thomas at the press conference. He had a lot of optimism about what this offense could be. Wanted to give you guys some of our takeaways from the press conference. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. A program we love talking about, going to continue to talk about over spring practice. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.